Hi everyone. Today I'm replacing the radiator in my 1987 Corvette, and I'm going to replace the stock radiator with a brand new DeWitt's all aluminum high performance radiator. Now my stock radiator came with a 1-inch core and it had plastic tanks on the end which would either crack after a while or they would just start to leak. But my new DeWitt's radiator has a 1.5-inch core and it's got large aluminum tanks which are welded on the end. So I won't have to worry about this leaking like the original one did. Now, I'm not doing this because my old radiator is leaking. I'm doing this because I live in Southern California. And on a hot summer day, instead of me getting to turn on the air conditioner, instead I get to roll down my windows when it's 110 degrees outside, turn on the heater and blow hot air at my face just so I can air condition the engine. So I said, enough is enough, and it's time to do something about it. So today, I'm going to show you everything that I go through in the process of removing my old radiator and replacing it with this new DeWitt's direct fit radiator, which is supposed to fit right in the exact same space that the old radiator was. Now I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, isn't this normally an entertainment channel? And yes, you are right. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. I'm not really a mechanic. I just play one on YouTube. So if you find me entertaining, or you feel that this video saves you hundreds of dollars because it enables you to change your radiator yourself, leave me a tip. I'm going to put a link down below in the description where you can hit the link and send me a tip. Now, no tip is too small, or is it too large? Send me a cup of coffee. Send me to the Caribbean. Buy me a brand new C8 Corvette with a retractable roof. And I want to let you know, I love red. So anyway, hit the subscribe button, please like my video, and please hit the bell so you get notified when I make more videos. And again, if you want to support my channel and see more videos just like this, send me that tip. So, first things first, I'm going to suggest that you watch this video all the way through so you can see all the tools I'm going to use and any of the blunders as I go through them. So, go ahead, order yourself a pizza, make the popcorn, snuggle up on your sofa, dim the lights down, and watch my version of From Here to Eternity. The first thing I'm going to do is disconnect the negative terminal on the battery with this 5/16" socket. Next, I'm going to jack up the car so I can go ahead and place this radiator drain pan underneath the radiator. Please don't drain your radiator coolant onto your driveway or your yard. Protect the environment and dispose of the coolant properly. Next, reach down below the radiator hose and the drain for the radiator is right there, and just turn it counterclockwise. The radiator drain is on the passenger side directly below the film, and it helps to go ahead and remove the cap to help the radiator drain. Next, I'm going to remove the mass airflow sensor. To do so, first I'm going to remove this electrical cable which is right here. There should be a clip right on the top, but someone's already broke mine off, but I don't worry about it because it's pretty well sealed to the elements, to the weather, with this little rubber gasket that goes between the two pieces. So once you take off the electrical connector, then you go ahead and loosen this hose clamp right over here. And after you've done that, you take a screwdriver and you just pop these off right here. This is what the mass airflow connector looks like once you removed it. You can see it's got this little green rubber that goes around it that seals it from the elements, seals out the water. Popping off the connector is literally this simple. You just pop back like that. And then do it the same thing to the other side. Like this. Now I'm going to reach in and push the mass airflow sensor straight back. And you can see it's got this corrugated tube on it. So push it straight back, which releases it, and then pull it gently to the side, and then just gently take it off. Now go put the mass airflow sensor somewhere safe because it is very delicate, as you can see right here. You do not want to get that wire inside of there dirty. Next, you want to remove this air duct. To do so, just reach in and turn these screws counterclockwise. And then do the same for that one right over there. When you're done, just pull straight up in the air and lift it off and pull it away. This is what it looks like once you've removed it. This may be a good time to change your air filter too. If you choose to do so, all you have to do is loosen these two screws, one over here and one over here. And then the front will come off and you can change your air filter and then just put it back together before you put it back in the car. Next, remove the electric cooling fan. There's two screws at the top. One is right here. One is over here underneath the radiator hose. And there's two directly below it in the same exact places. I'm using a 1/2-inch socket and a ratchet to remove those screws. Note that when you remove the screw on the driver's side, that you're also going to be loosening the clamp that holds the radiator hose in place, the upper radiator hose. And just make a note that that clamp goes behind the shroud, not between the shroud and the fan. So you've got to put it behind the shroud when you're done, when you put it back together. Now lift the clamp up and just move it out of the way so you can put it back on later. I decided to put my arm underneath the car, right inside the tire, to loosen the one on the driver's side bottom. It's just easier to maneuver it this way. I'm doing the same thing on the passenger side. I'm putting my arm underneath it to actually loosen the screw. It's the only way I could see to get in there, unless you have a lift. Directly under the upper radiator hose, there is a fastener that holds the electrical wire to the fan motor. You need to disconnect that fastener so it will release the wire. To do so, just lift up right here and then pull the bottom out like that. Now gently lift up the fan housing so you can go back in there and disconnect that wire. Be careful that you don't lift it too high, otherwise you will tear off that green ground wire. But there's a little tab at the bottom of the connector. Gently press down and pull the connector out. So this is what the connector looks like. And that tab goes on the very bottom of the fan like that. So that's why you have to lift underneath it or press down from underneath it to remove that tab on the top there. Once you've done that, just go ahead and lift the fan straight out. Now disconnect the upper radiator hose. A lot of people disconnect the lower radiator hose on the passenger side next, but it's a little difficult to get to. So I'm going to go ahead and wait until I remove the top of the shroud. And once I've removed this, I will remove the lower radiator hose. So the next thing I'm going to do is disconnect the reservoir hose right over here. Now I'm going to disconnect the upper transmission cooler line. And to do so, don't use a regular wrench. I like to use the flared wrenches because they will keep you from stripping the nut. Next, disconnect the coolant level connector, which is right here. Just pull on it, just like that. There are 5 bolts on each side that need to be removed. This is one. That's another. Here's the third, the fourth, and the fifth. These bolts are 10 millimeter. So just simply use a socket, put it in place, and just start removing them. Now do the same thing on the passenger side. There's 2 in the front, 1 here on the side, 1 here in the back on the side, and then there's 1 right there. Right along the front of the shroud, there are 6 7 millimeter screws that need to be removed. They look just like that. They run all along the front. In addition to the 4 I just showed you on top, there's 1 on the side in this position on each side. There are actually 6 screws on the passenger side that fasten to the shroud. This one goes to the power steering reservoir, and you need to remove that one also. Remove this power steering reservoir bolt, and after you've done so, come to the other side on the back, closest to the engine in the center, and just loosen that one, and it will allow you to turn the power steering reservoir out of the way of the fan shroud, which is locking it right now, as you can see. You can see that now you can just twist this out of the way, and it's no longer in the way of the fan shroud. There's actually one more bolt on the passenger side also that needs to be removed. So there's actually 6 bolts on each side. Here's another one holding the accumulator in place, and that one needs to be removed so we can twist the accumulator out of the way. Again, I was using a 10mm socket to do this. Now just lift off the shroud. It may take a little bit of wiggling to do so, but everything is now out of the way. Now I'm going to remove my lower radiator hose because it's just a little bit easier to get to now that the shroud is off. I actually got this super long screwdriver for Harbor Freight, and it was $10 for both a slotted and a Phillips, and it easily allows you to get right to that hose clamp. So actually, if I'd used a screwdriver, I could have removed this hose without taking the top of the shroud off, but it's still easier to do once the top is off. This is all of the stuff that's accumulated between my radiator and the condenser. This is definitely a reason the engine will start running warmer. Make sure you clean all of that out. I'm going to change the radiator feet because I bought a DeWitt's radiator, and the DeWitt's is 1.5 inches thick. It's a single core 1.5 inches thick. They also make a single 1-inch thick radiator, but the one that I bought for normal use is a much better radiator than came with the car and will give me better cooling, and I'm not racing this car, so I don't need a double row radiator. But either way, those feet at the bottom on each side, and then also at the top of the shroud, are going to have to be changed. So I'm going to pull the old feet out, finish cleaning up, and then put the new feet in. So I got everything pretty well cleaned up in there. I used a plastic container to lift the condenser so I wouldn't have to take it out. And I just used some paper towels, rags, and some water and just cleaned it pretty much. And now I'm going to go ahead and install the new feet. I noticed that the factory feet, which hold the radiator and condenser in place, are a pair. You have a smaller side on the outside, a bigger side on the inside. The same is the same for the radiator itself. You can see that they're actually a pair. However, the DeWitt's are all the same way. They're identical on both sides. So when you flip it over the other way, you can see that they've got the big opening. So I don't know if this is a design flaw or they just shipped me 4 identical rubber feet. So I'm going to go ahead and modify these. I'm going to take one of these over here with an X-Acto knife, and I'm going to open this up so my condenser will fit. And you only have to do that on one side because one side is correct, the other side is incorrect. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I decided to go ahead and change the lower radiator hose while I'm here. So half of it's already disconnected, and it's a little hard to get to. I mean, if you look down below, you can see what you've got to go through. So I decided to go ahead and remove the serpentine belt, which might give me a little bit more room. So I'm not saying you have to do this, but it's just a choice that I chose to do. So to do so, just make a note of how your belt goes. There's a diagram on the shroud, but you can see it's coming up above the air pump, down below the center, up and around the compressor. From under the compressor, it goes around the tensioner and then around the crankshaft, and then up over the power steering pump, Then it goes around the alternator, and again, up and over the small pump. I gave my car to a mechanic once who insisted on helping me change my alternator. And he also insisted on using the screw to the left there and loosening it to release the serpentine belt, even though I told him that was incorrect. And in the process, he ended up losing Freon in my air conditioning system. And since then, I just decided, you know what, I'm working on my car, unless I'm going to a Corvette shop, who knows what they're doing. So anyway, the way you release the serpentine belt is you put a breaker bar right in that square little opening, which is right here. If you don't have a breaker bar, use a 1/2-inch socket. And then you just take it and you twist down, and it will release the belt. So this is what I'm referring to. I'm just going to press my ratchet down, it will loosen the tensioner, and the belt would just slide right off. So I found out that the easiest way to release the serpentine belt was to release it from the water pump first. Just slide it over the bottom of the pulley and it came right off. You can see now there's a lot more room to get into there to release the lower radiator hose, which is going right to the water pump. So I'm going to remove that next with that screw. This is the water pump side of my radiator hose. And it's also good to notice that that clamp is really close to the edge of the hose opening. And I always make sure I have at least 1/4 inch when I'm putting on a hose clamp, because otherwise one day under pressure it could just pop the whole hose right off. So make sure you give more clearance than this when you're installing your new hose. The other side of the hose, which was on the radiator side, was actually quite good. This is a good way to go ahead and install the hose clamp. Okay, so removing the serpentine belt literally made it easy to change the water pump hose. And now I've got the serpentine belt back on, and I do admit that I took off the dryer, the receiver dryer or the accumulator from the air conditioner, because there was nothing in the air conditioner, no Freon, because the car was running too warm to actually use the air conditioner because my radiator wasn't really cooling the engine well. And I found myself literally turning on the heater just to cool the car. So I made my life simple. I took off the accumulator, and it's making this whole process so much easier to do. You don't have to, it's not necessary. It will just take you a little bit more time, but that's where I'm at. So the next thing is installing the new feet that I'm getting from DeWitt's. I decided not to go ahead and try to modify them because they're actually molded. They're molded literally into the car right down there. And there's literally has to be a pair of them. There's got to be a pair, and they fit as a left and a right for the top and the bottom, so you really need to use the right ones that come with the radiator. This is a picture of my old radiator that I took out, which I suspect is leaking. I can't really confirm it because it was a slow leak. It would leak when it wants to. But being that it's discolored in here, I just suspect that radiator coolant had been coming out of here. Can't say I'm positive of that, but it just appears that this radiator needed to be changed no matter what anyway. And the plastic tanks aren't cracked or anything. And I don't know what all the sludge is coming from in here, but I just decided to change the radiator, and I'm going to flip it over and show you the other side. So this is the front side of the radiator that faces to the front of the car. And as you can see, all of this leaves and debris are keeping the radiator from cooling properly. I don't have any idea how this stuff can get in the radiator. It seems pretty sealed in the front of the car, but somehow it goes around and it gets clogged in there, and it reduces the ability of the radiator to cool the car. You're also going to need to remove the low coolant sensor from your old radiator and put it on your new one. There's a tab on the top and on the bottom of the sensor, so just use a screwdriver to gently pry up on the top, pry down on the bottom, and then pull out the sensor. I saw when I disconnected the fan that the plug was extremely dirty. So I'm going to take some CRC electronic cleaner, and I'm going to spray that and clean that up. I'll probably use a toothbrush on that also, just to get the crud out of there. This is really important because if you don't do this, you're just going to raise the resistance in the wires, and you're eventually going to melt this connector which has happened to me before. So I've sprayed it with the CRC and I've cleaned it with the toothbrush. It got a lot of the crud out of there, but the connector is still dark. So I'm going to grab a wire brush and see if I can rough up that surface to give it better connectivity. Also, don't forget to wear safety goggles before you spray the connector, just to protect your eyes. So you can see the wire brush really did the trick and really cleaned that up nicely. So now I'm going to spray some more CRC electronic cleaner on there to make sure all the crud is out. And then when I put it back together, I'm going to go ahead and seal this little rubber sealer that goes around the plug. And what I'm going to use is the same grease that I put around the boots of my spark plug wires. I have some Excel grease, not recommending Excel, but it works great for me. And it will keep that rubber soft, and it will keep out all of the moisture and dirt. Here's something else that you do not have to do. I removed the AC condenser, only because I realized how dirty it still was deep inside of here. And I've cleaned this now, as you can see. But the AC condenser is literally filled with dirt and sand. And you can see all of this dirt and debris in here. And when I hold it up to the light, you cannot even see through it, except in a couple of spots. So I know this is definitely causing the engine to run hotter than I want it to. So I'm going to take a toothbrush and brush some of this debris off. Then I'm going to lay it face down and pour some water through it from the other side. I don't have canned air, I don't have a compressor, so this is my best solution. The proper radiator supports have arrived. DeWitt's was kind enough to overnight them to me, and here they are. You can definitely see that I now have two pairs, because there's a smaller opening on the outside and a larger opening on the inside for the condenser on both sides. You can also see that the mold is different for one side and then for the other side. So I'm going to get started and put these in. As you can see, there's no way to confuse them. They're molded right into the radiator support, and you should have a left side and a right side. So just lift that piece up and press it in. You can see that there's a little guide right below it. So you just press it into place right here. And I'm going to use two hands to make sure it's locked securely in place. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the driver's side of the car. There's the little guide on the bottom. Just compress it in place. There we go. That should be it. No, it's not going in. So I'm just gonna maybe put a little bit of grease on that one before I press it in place. Okay, I put just a little bit of grease in that hole. I also put a little bit of grease right here. And let's hope that this time we get success. Lining it up. Well, it kind of feels okay. Yeah, it feels pretty good. Okay, we're good. Next, I'm going to go ahead and put the accumulator bracket back on the crossbeam of the car. Again, you don't have to take off the accumulator. I did so because it was easier for me to change my radiator hose, and there was no Freon or R134 in the system at all, so it was easier for me to take it off. You can see that there's an upper and a lower bolt that hold it in place. Here are the two holes right on the crossbeam which hold up the accumulator bracket. And if you want to know where that is, it's just directly below your tensioner. So all you have to do, just take it, and just slide into space right there, and then just bolt it down. It helps to have the accumulator hose on top of the bracket, before you go ahead and thread those screws into position. After you get them started, I went ahead and I fastened those 2 screws back into position just to make sure everything was going to line up. And now that I've done so, I'm going to go ahead and go back here and I'm going to tighten up those screws. After you tighten the accumulator screws, which are on the back of the crossbeam, you're going to need to remove these screws so you can put the radiator shroud back on. So the condenser is back in the car and it sits perfectly in the rubber supports. Be very careful when connecting the condenser hoses back together. They need to spin freely. If you feel any binding, you're in the wrong angle. So just keep playing with it until it spins freely. Otherwise, you're going to go ahead and cross-thread it and you'll be replacing your condenser. Next, it's time to put in the radiator. And here's the unveiling of my new DeWitt's radiator. Well, they've definitely packaged this really well to make sure there would be no damage in shipment. And now's the time to pull it out of the box. Definitely a premium, well-constructed item. You can see on the sides, the tanks are aluminum instead of the original plastic, which always tend to leak at the seam. These are larger than the original plastic ones, so the radiator is going to hold more coolant. The core is 1.5 inches thick instead of the original 1 inch thick. And then on the side, all the necessary fittings: the drain, transmission line, little radiator hose which goes to the water pump, coolant level, upper transmission line, and this is what it looks like right on top. If you have someone to help you put it into the car, that would be best, but I don't. So I gently put my hand along the bottom of the core so as not to grab any of the fins, and then placed it into this position. Now I'm going to go over to the other side and gently lift up on the driver's side and let it slide down. And I can see that it's definitely perfectly in place on the rubber feet. Same thing on this side. Everything is just nice and snug. And actually I didn't need 2 people at all. It was just very simple. And it fits perfectly in place, just like my old radiator did. So I'm now going to start to go ahead and connect the lower transmission line first. I've placed the lower transmission line inside the radiator. I've started to turn it. Be careful you don't cross thread it. And make sure everything goes in nice and easy. Then take a 1/2 inch flare wrench and tighten it the rest of the way. Again, use a wrench with a flare, otherwise you will strip this. I placed my wrench on the fitting from underneath the car because it's just the easiest way to get in there. And there's just so much room next to the tire that it just seems the best way to do it. I mistakenly had placed this radiator hose on this side of the transmission line. So I reached in and pulled it out so I can get it in first, because this line must be above it. So make sure you don't make that mistake when you're changing your hose. But it's an easy fix. For me, the easiest way to get this radiator hose back on was to put one hand on the bottom to hold the bottom of the opening open, and then put one hand on top, and then just push it in. I actually slid my hand in from this little hole right over here, which then will get to the top of the radiator fitting, and then one hand from the bottom. It seems to me that's the best way to put the hose on. Let me see if I could show you. Hopefully the camera won't move. Make sure that the corrugated plastic that surrounds your new radiator hose is in the proper position. It needs to protect the hose against the transmission line and then also against the tensioner and the frame. It's time to put the shroud back on the car. But before we do so, we have to replace these 2 rubber guides with the ones that came with the new DeWitt's radiator. And they look like these. It's real simple. just take these here and just pull them off. And then just pop the new ones in place. I had to put a little bit of grease on them and then I just pulled them right through. It was real simple once I lubricated them. On the passenger side, when putting the shroud back on, you're gonna have to pull back the transmission line and also push the accumulator bracket out of the way. And then the shroud will fall right into place. Next, I'm gonna put the 6 10mm screws on the passenger side back in. There's 2 in the front, there's 1 right here, 1 right there, and then there's 2 underneath the accumulator bracket. Make sure the accumulator bracket is on top of the shroud before you put in the screws. And I'm just gonna start the screws and wait till all the screws are in on both sides and in the front of the shroud before I tighten everything securely. On the driver's side, take the power steering canister and twist it back into position so the bracket goes right above the shroud. After you're done, place the bolt in there and then go ahead and replace the bolt which goes over here and tighten up this bolt which goes right there. And then replace the other 5 bolts on the driver's side of the shroud. 1 right there. And then there's going to be 1 right over here on the other side of the hose. And then there's going to be 1 here on the side. Right there. And then there's 1 in the front and another 1 in the front. I had an issue. The upper and the lower shroud on the driver's side didn't line up perfectly. There was between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch of space, and I didn't want to just force it down because ultimately it's just going to break. So I went ahead, took the shroud off, and I noticed that the condenser was not exactly where it belonged. It moved or shifted slightly when I installed the radiator in the shroud. So I went ahead and I took the feet or the guides off the shroud and I placed them on top of the car. And I'm going to just try to go ahead and put the shroud over them and see if I can pull it through these little supports right here and see if that'll work and give me a better fit. That seems to have done the trick. This is the driver's side and it fits so much better now. And this is the passenger side. Much better fit. Okay, I took off the shroud again, mainly because I couldn't get the screw to line up with this clip over here because it moved when I was cleaning. So I'm gonna go ahead and check all the clips, make sure they all line up, and hopefully you're gonna learn from my mistake and do it right the first time. 3 times was a charm. I went ahead and lined up the 6 7mm screws which run along the front of the shroud. There's 1 on the side here, as we've seen before. There's 4 on top. And there's 1 on the exact same side on the passenger side. Here's the 1 on the passenger side. Afterwards, I went ahead and I started all of the bolts, the 10mm bolts, which go on the passenger side, making sure that the 2 went on top of the bracket of the accumulator, and then put in the other 4. There's 2 in the front, 1 there on the side, and 1 over there. Then I lined up the 10mm bolts which go on the driver's side. You can see I'm missing 1 right there, and I'm missing 1 in the front, because whoever worked on the car last put 2 of the wrong bolts in and they weren't really doing anything. So I'm gonna have to replace those with the correct ones. Then I reinstalled the bolt that goes on the bracket from the power steering reservoir and put it right on top of the shroud. Reinstalled the bolt which goes on this side of the reservoir, and right on the other side there's a bolt right there that you have to retighten. I went ahead and hand tightened these 7mm screws with a socket and an extension, pretty much giving me the same kind of torque I would get from a screwdriver. And then I did the same thing on the 10mm screws which run on each side, when I used a longer extension which gave me a little bit more torque. There's no reason to really ratchet these tightly. If you do so, you're just going to crack your shroud. So that's it. I've got a great fit on the passenger side of the shroud and a great fit on the driver's side of the shroud. I didn't finish this last night, so I went ahead and protected all the openings with either paper towels or tape. So instead of installing the coolant level sensor next, I decided to go ahead and install the fan next. And here's the reason. This particular connector, which goes to the coolant level sensor, also connects to the fan and it runs all the way through. So you can get a little bit of extra play by reaching down and pulling back on it, which then allows you to get this connector high up in the air. So it'll be easier to connect the fan if you do so now rather than later. So I'm going to do that next. I noticed that my fan is all rusty. And being that it's rusty on the outside and it's not sealed, I figured that problems were probably going to occur on the inside. So rather than wait, I decided to change it while it's out of the car. It tells you right on the fan that it is a left-hand thread. So to remove it, you have to turn to the right. Normally turning to the right would tighten it, but in this case, turning to the right with your ratchet will loosen it. And then of course the reverse is the same to tighten it. Now I'm going to use a 1/2-inch socket. You could also use a 13mm. I'm going to place it right over the nut and I'm going to remove it. To remove it, I'm going to hold one hand on the blade just to hold it down, then use my other hand to use the ratchet. Once you've removed the nut, just simply reach in and take the blade right off the motor. When you look at the other side, you see it's got 8 little pins, which go ahead and then correlate with the motor. So when you put it back together, make sure you line those pins up correctly with the motor before you fasten it back down. The next thing we're going to do is remove those 3 10mm bolts. Once you've done that, the motor will just slide right out. And we're ready to put the new motor in. Here are the new motor and the old motor side by side. They pretty much look identical, except for this spacer. And I'm going to remove it because there's no reason to use it on our Corvette. And I would rather the fan blade sit flush against this plate. They also sent all this hardware with it, which I'm also not going to use because the screws don't work. They do use this nut over here, a left-threaded nut, but I'm not going to use that either with the washer because the original washer has a much larger surface area. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the original nuts, original bolts, and put this fan back together. The fan only goes back in one way. There's no way to make a mistake. You can see this area right here for the electrical connector is going to go ahead and slide right into this groove right over here. So just go ahead and lift this up and put your screws back in. We've got it all back together and the fan spins freely, so we're good to go. Just a general note, there's a warning that came with the motor that says do not over torque the center nut that goes on the shaft, because doing so may cause the fan to seize up. But you know, this is a left-hand thread, so it's not really going to come off when the fan is spinning, and that's why it's a left-hand thread. So I'm going to go ahead and get ready and go put this back in the car. So you can see I've got a lot of extra space now with the fan connector where I can lift it right on top of the fan shroud because I haven't connected the other side of it to the low coolant sensor. I'm just going to put a little bit of tune-up grease on the inside of the housing of the fan motor that this connects to and see if that helps. You don't need much. I'm just trying to keep water and dirt out of the inside of this connector. So here's the reason you connect the connector before you bolt the fan back into the car. I was not able to put the connector back on the back of the fan, and I noticed that these pins over here really need to be bent up, because when I look at my original motor, I noticed that they are. You can see right there, there's more space at the bottom of the pin than there is at the top there. When you look at it over here, it's actually just the opposite. There's more space at the top than at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and get a screwdriver and gently pry those pins upward. Hopefully that's enough and that does the trick. That did the trick. So I've dropped the fan back into position and I've slid the green wire all the way across the cross member over to the low coolant sensor so there'll be plenty of wire for me to attach it later. Now I'm going to go ahead and start bolting the fan to the shroud. I found out in the past that it's easier for me to just align the top without putting the bolts in, and then put the lower bolt in here on the driver's side and reach over the tire and just start screwing it in with the socket wrench. So I've got that started. Now I'm going to go to the passenger side. So what I did is I put the bolt first into a 6-sided Craftsman socket, 1/2 inch to be exact, and then I pressed the whole extension through with the socket, and it was very easy to line this up. If you try to put the bolt on without the socket, it will take you forever trying to get your fingers in there. And I've learned this from past experience. This tool really helped me. It's a short 3/8 extension on a 1/2 inch socket. It's a 6-sided socket which holds the bolt really well. And that little black ring around it really helps when you're getting your fingers in there and you're trying to twist the bolt tighter. Now I'm installing the upper passenger side. I've just pressed that in place, and now I'm just going to twist it tighter. Before attaching the top bolt on the driver's side, you need to go ahead and take the bracket for the radiator hose and move it back into position. It just slides right there, and it needs to be on the back side so you can get the bolt in. And then just go ahead and bolt it together. On this one, I had to wiggle the fan shroud up and down in order for the bolt to align, so just keep that in mind. But anyway, that's what it looks like once it's in position. So now I'm going to just tighten up all 4 bolts. On the passenger side of the fan shroud, I used a short extension on the ratchet. On the driver's side, I took the extension off the ratchet and I tightened it in this position, putting my hand over the tire and then underneath the car. I'm going to connect the battery and see if this fan works before I go any further. Next, I place a paper clip in the A terminal and the B terminal of the ALCL connector. The A connector and the B connector are the 2 on the top right-hand side. So the A is on the top right, and then just to the left of it is the B. Now I'm turning on the ignition switch without starting the engine, and I care immediately that the fan has turned on. Let's go take a look. The fan is on and it's running perfectly. So glad I did that, especially since the fan was giving me an issue with that connector. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn off the ignition and disconnect the battery. Next, I'm going to attach the fan wire back to the shroud with that clip. DeWitt said I may need to put a little bit of grease on the low coolant sensor before installing it back into the radiator. And I tried it without it, and the fitting is very tight. As you can see, it's an aluminum fitting, and the original tanks were plastic. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease on it and then press it into position. I put the grease on the inside of the actual fitting rather than on the actual sensor, and I just pressed it in. But make sure you press it in all the way until it is flush, just to make sure it is securely fastened. Now I'm going to go ahead and reconnect the connector, and then we'll move on. Next, I'm attaching the upper transmission coolant line. Again, make sure that it does not bind when you put it in, or that you cross-thread it. Just make sure it spins into position. Then use a 1/2 inch flare wrench to tighten it. If you use any other kind of wrench, you will strip that fitting. It helped for me to press the transmission line all the way into the fitting and make sure that it was seated all the way back. Then I started to finger tighten it. Then once I did that, and I was sure that it was not going to bind, I started to use the wrench. And you can see I'm just tightening it easily. And that's that. Next, I installed the coolant reservoir hose. I like keeping that clamp a little bit on the low side with the screw down, just so when I take off the radiator cap, it's never in the way of my hand. Next, I reinstalled the accumulator. I used 2 crescent wrenches to tighten those fittings, 2 crescent wrenches to tighten these fittings, and then there's another bolt right down here that you need to tighten to secure the canister to the bracket. There's also a bolt that I removed right over here. You can see the hole there. And by removing that bolt, it allows this hose to move a little easier, which allows you to then line up the hoses to the canister a little easier also. And when tightening up the hoses, when you're using the crescent wrenches, one is basically just holding the canister and the other one is just tightening the hose. Here's an image of what I'm talking about. I'm going to use my left hand on this wrench and just hold it in place, and then take my right hand on this one and then just pull up in this direction here, that way. Next, I sprayed my mass airflow sensor connector with the CRC electronic cleaner just to make sure it's nice and clean and the contacts are all working properly. Now is a good time to open up the air intake duct, clean it out, and install a new air filter. Mine was filled with dirt and debris. Then put it back into position and fasten it down with those 2 thumb nuts. Next, I'm going to take the mass airflow sensor, press it into the corrugated tube. Before doing so, I'm going to pull the tube off to the side like this, press it in place, and then push it back far enough so it will clear the air duct. Then align those clips on each side and press them into place. Now plug the mass airflow sensor connector back into the sensor. Now connect the upper radiator hose to the new radiator. Mine binded a little with the outside edge of the shroud, but I was able to wiggle it into position. Now tighten up your clamp and make sure this is in the proper position. Now add your coolant. I'm creating my own 50-50 mixture using Prestone concentrate and distilled water. Never use anything but distilled water when mixing it with the antifreeze. If you were to use well water or if you were to use city water, you're only going to create harmful deposits on the engine. My Prestone funnel didn't fit inside the radiator, so I made one out of a 2-liter soda bottle. Fits just perfectly. As soon as I started putting the Prestone antifreeze inside the radiator, it started coming right out of the bottom. So obviously I closed the drain cock in the wrong direction. When I received my radiator, the wing nut was turned to the left or counterclockwise almost completely. So I just used my thumb and tightened it a little bit to the left, assuming that was the correct direction to close the system. But that is incorrect. You need to turn to the right or clockwise because that is tight or closed, as it says right here on the DeWitt's website. And it also says to only use your thumb to tighten it. Hand tighten only. Do not use a wrench, because doing so will damage the system. So be very careful. By the way, I screwed the bottle into the radiator neck, kind of like screwing a bolt into a nut, and it just fits perfectly and it holds right in place. Next thing I'm going to do is reconnect the battery, start the engine, and let some of the coolant cross through the radiator, add a little bit more coolant, put the cap on, and see how it runs. I'm not suggesting you do this. What I'm waiting for is for the thermostat to open and the coolant to start coming through the radiator. Once that happens, I'll add a little bit more coolant and put on the cap. I can see now that the coolant is going across the radiator. So I'm going to go ahead, add a little bit more coolant, bring it up to the neck, and then put on the cap. Okay, I've closed up the system. I'm going to go ahead and take the car for a spin, and then check for leaks. And I also bought a new radiator pad that I will replace as soon as I know that the system is leak-free. This is my old radiator pad, and I got a new recommended one, which is an RC81, recommended by AC Delco and General Motors. I also want to show you that the fan kicked on perfectly right when it was supposed to. I put a thermostat in there, or an engine coolant sensor, temperature sensor, that makes the fan come in at 185 degrees. I live in Southern California, and I don't want this engine getting up to 225 degrees before that fan kicks in. But the fan is running perfectly. Also, with the fan on and the engine running, it's currently running at 187 degrees, which is good for me. So I found my coolant leak. It seems that somebody that worked on the car disconnected the coolant hose going to the reservoir, and I just had coolant coming out underneath the car. It stopped now because it ran out of coolant to leak. But anyway, this seems to be what my problem was all along, and I never noticed this. So let me look underneath the car and I'll show you. So you can see there's my leak. So I'm going to get a screwdriver, put it back on, and test the engine again and see if it's got any other leaks. Okay, that should do it. I've securely fastened the hose onto the coolant reservoir tank, and I'm going to take it for a spin, check it for leaks when I get back, and also check it for leaks tomorrow morning. I was told by the dealer that this is the wrong cap for my car. It's an RC27. And if you look at AutoZone or any of the other auto parts stores, it also says it's the wrong part for my car and that it doesn't fit. And then furthermore, when I look inside, I can see that on the inside of the rubber, it's got this groove there from the old radiator. So just to be sure, I decided to replace the cap, and I installed this new RC81. Even though it says RC33, they are the same part. And I've installed this. It's a 15-pound cap. It's also recommended by DeWitt's to get a 13 to 15-pound cap. So I'm going to go ahead and take the car for a ride and just see how it runs. That's it. We're done. I got the radiator in the car. I checked it for leaks. We have no leaks. The engine is running nice and cool. And I now have a better radiator than the factory ever gave me for my Corvette. So next year in hot Los Angeles, when it's 110 degrees, instead of me having to open my windows and turn on the heater just to cool the engine, I'll be able to turn on the air conditioner and cool me. Finito, the end. If you found this video entertaining, or you feel that it saved you money, or if you just want to contribute to my channel, once again, please leave me a tip. There's a link down below in the description where you may do so. And also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell. And thank you for watching my version of From Here to Eternity. Till next time.